Hey, good morning, everybody. Voy pasando la asistencia.
All right, so we're going to be making up the class we should have had last Wednesday. That was apparently not meant to be a lab, and I did not cancel. So you guys have to watch this video. Within this video, you're going to find a password. It's going to be a piece of a song. You'll see a screenshot of um, the artist name and the song, but you'll also hear it play since I know that some of you might be playing this in the background while you're doing something else, and I want you to have an opportunity to see that password. That's why I don't do them just written. So to completely make up this class, you have to watch the video. After you watch the video, you have to complete a quiz, or you can complete the quiz during. So the quiz is set for an hour. Yeah, about an hour, which is longer than this recording is. So that way you can have it open while you're watching the video, and then you can complete it as you go, or you can complete it at the end if you don't have the time to do it now. But it is required to complete the quiz. So, recapitulo en español por si acaso. Bien importante. Vamos a reponer la clase del miércoles pasado, que hubo un error en si era laboratorio o no. Tienen que ver esta grabación. Hay dos cosas que tienen que hacer. Dentro de este video van a encontrar un password que va a ser un audio, va a ser el pedazo de una canción, unos segunditos, va a salir el screenshot de la canción, el título y el artista, pero también va a estar el audio por si alguno de ustedes está escuchando la presentación pero no están sentados viéndolo, así no pierden la oportunidad de tener ese password. El password lo necesitan para el quiz que tienen que completar. Si el password que usted pone no es el password correcto, usted reprueba el quiz aunque estén las preguntas correctas, porque yo tengo que asegurarme que no estemos nada más mirando la presentación por encima, sino que estemos, ¿verdad?, escuchando los ejemplos que se están utilizando en la clase, la información adicional que se da que quizás no está en el PowerPoint. So, bien importante que tengamos eso en cuenta. Entonces, luego completan el quiz lo pueden completar mientras están viendo la presentación. La duración del quiz creo que lo dejé para que sea una hora, que es about twice as long as lo que va a ser esta presentación. Eh, pero si no, pues también lo pueden completar rapidito luego de que hayan completado la grabación. O si tienen tiempo, tú sabes, ahora de ver la grabación pero no de hacer el quiz, pues si tienen la oportunidad de completarlo luego. Pero es bien importante que busquemos ese password y que completemos el quiz. Al final les voy a hablar de una oportunidad de bono. La oportunidad de bono no es requerida, pero sí es una oportunidad de tener 5 puntos adicionales para su nota final.
Today we're going to talk about reading strategies. Sé que no hemos todavía terminado la actividad de lo del vocabulary, academic vocabulary, pero pues nada, voy a get through this. Si no lo han terminado, entonces le doy el resto de la clase para que terminen y lo presentamos al principio de la próxima clase. Um, so, antes de empezar, very quickly, reminders, tienen un foro que es para el viernes, viene siendo el 12. El foro es en forma de video, son no escrito. Bueno, so van a ver un video que está dentro de la tarea que habla específicamente un poco más de collocations, que ya habíamos hablado de collocations hace la semana pasada, la semana anterior. Van a escoger entonces 5 collocations en inglés y 5 en español, de las que aparecen en el video, y van a escribir un total de 10 oraciones, 5 con las 5 en español, 5 con las 5 en inglés. Esto, si quieren, o lo pueden decir verbalmente en el video, o me pueden entonces entregar un Word doc que tenga las 10 oraciones, y entonces el video va respondiendo a esto. El video son 2 a 3 minutos. ¿Cuál es la importancia de los collocations en mejorar nuestra fluidez y nuestra decisión de comunicación en otro idioma? ¿Cuáles estrategias pueden utilizar para aprender y recordar estos collocations? Y ejemplos de cómo esos collocations aparecen dentro de contextos académicos o del diario vivir, pues en español o en inglés. Muy importante, ¿verdad? Que no se les olvide, parte de su nota es que tienen que responderle a 2 de sus compañeros. Esto puede ser escrito, no tienen que hacerle un video en response al video, pero por lo menos a 2 de sus compañeros, ¿verdad? Proveyendo retroalimentación en su uso de los collocations, en cuán correctos estén, y entonces en el uso del lenguaje académico. También pueden sugerirle ejemplos o, ¿verdad? Correcciones, maneras en que pueden mejorar. Bien importante, para entonces publicar el video le van a dar al botoncito de reply. Es posible que el video no quiera subir porque la plataforma es un poco antigua para con lo moderno que están los teléfonos. Así que si les está costando subir el video directamente a la plataforma, lo pueden subir a Google Drive o lo pueden subir a YouTube como un video unlisted y entonces ponen el enlace del video. El video entonces se debe titular video _1 _ su nombre. Y muy importante, ¿verdad? Si usted está teniendo problemas técnicos, ¿verdad? Me pueden escribir si Google Drive y YouTube no le están funcionando o si quieren que les envíe unos video tutorials. Pero importante que no estemos haciendo entrega de la tarea ni por email, ni por los mensajes de Canvas, ni por el assignment comment box de la tarea. No me permiten corregir tareas así que tiene que ser directamente en el reply. ¿Alguna duda o pregunta sobre este foro?
En el video tienes que decir la oración o la oración va en un documento aparte.
Como prefieran, las pueden decir al principio y entonces responder a estas preguntas o me pueden entregar un Word doc con las oraciones y entonces el video que nada más se enfoque en esta parte. ¿Alguna otra dudita pregunta? Ok. Luego de eso, tienen un quiz para el 19 de septiembre, eso viene siendo el otro viernes de arriba, son 25 preguntas. Te escoge, tiene blanco y cierto y falso, tienen 30 minutos para completarlo. Si usted tiene un acomodo razonable, entonces es importante que me notifiquen por escrito para entonces hacerle el ajuste de tiempo que en vez de 30 son 45 minutos. Ya luego hablamos de la tarea del 26 para no overwhelm you con tanta cosa a la vez. Entonces, por ahora nos enfocamos en el foro, video forum del viernes y en el quiz de esta semana. Okay. So, reading strategies. When we hear those words, we're referring to specific techniques used to read critically. So, all of you obviously know how to read, but there's a difference between simply reading a text and then actually analyzing the information in it, right? Some of you may have read information in passing, right? You've been bored and you left your phone in your room and now you're somehow reading the back of your shampoo bottle because you have nothing better to do in the bathroom. You're not really internalizing what any of this information means, right? So we use reading strategies to actually be able to analyze a text and go beyond the superficial or the obvious explanation or understanding of a text. So we have to be able to comprehend ideas such as themes, subtext, and context. So if I'm reading a novel, right, I should be able by the end of it to say, well, this novel's themes involve family and honesty and being an immigrant, right? That might be some of the themes that a particular novel is carrying. So if somebody were to ask me, right, oh, did you like this novel? Yes or no, that's a superficial reading, whereas a critical reading could be, oh, I found it was really interesting to me how the theme of family was explored through immigration, through the lens of immigration, right? That's a completely different approach to it. Subtext then are information that is hinted at, but it's not directly there. Some of you may have seen that meme that is just kind of like when your professor explains to you that the curtains are blue because they represent melancholy and sadness, but really the curtains were just blue. That's where subtext comes from, right? When writing, we rarely ever, at least in the realm of fiction, we rarely ever use words that are just pointless, right? You're trying to convey something in how people dress, in how people, the way the setting is set up, certain colors, certain emotions, etc., are sometimes in the subtext. So for example, when I was in my undergrad, I had a professor who would have us write entire like 5 to 7 page essays on a single word in a novel. And we had to explain, you know, was the conscious reason why this was said and the subconscious, right? Because sometimes we had a character say something and actually mean the opposite. And there was something to explore there that we saw through subtext. And then context obviously is the world in which this is happening, right? So if, for example, we take a book like The Hunger Games, right? The context is the games themselves, but there is a political subtext, right? About classism, about wealth disparity, right? So these are themes that we can see within the subtext, even if the context seems to be fictional. So reading strategies can be used before, during, and after the beginning of reading. So some ways to then prepare to read, right? especially if we're not big avid readers who are, used to it. Right, it's important to then go into a text with a mindset where we want to know, what do we want to get out of this reading, right? So we have to set a purpose. Why are we doing this? Even if it's for a class, right? Even if it's just, because my professor assigned me to read it, right? We have to understand that at least what is the connection between the course content and the text itself, right? So, for example, in a different class that I teach, I had them read a short story, called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omilas, which is about like this child who is basically tortured as a sacrifice so that this particular town can have happiness. And superficially, I know a lot of them went like, what in the world did this professor just make me read? Right? But within the context of course, right? It's a course about philosophy, it's a course about ethics, it's a course about how perception is shaped by our lives, right? So to us, super messed up, they're sacrificing this child. To people who have only ever lived in a society where this child has always been sacrificed, it's not that weird, it's just every other day. So even outside of our academic context, right? If we open up a news article, right? Why are we reading it? Probably because the topic is interesting to us or it's important to us. You see a particular crime that happened in your particular town, right? You're gonna click on it because you're like, wait, let me see if there's somebody I know who was involved. Let me see if, maybe this was close to my house. I wanna know, if I'm gonna get to my home and the roads are gonna be blocked off, right? Maybe it was somebody I know, right? And then obviously in terms of fiction, right? We picked up a book for a reason. We don't just randomly just grab a book and start reading. There's something about it, whether it's the cover, whether it's the author, whether it's reading the blurb, right? What about it drew us to it? If the text has to be read before completing an assignment, right? It's important to do things like reading the rest of the assignment instructions. That can help us understand why you're being assigned to read a particular text. So if I'm looking at instructions and I say, here, read this short story, and then you have to do an analysis of the themes of culture presented in that short story, right? Then I can see, okay, I'm particularly going into this short story that I'm reading, looking for cultural elements, right? Language, traditions, food, music, right? Things that make up a cultural context. And then we can also make it personal and consider real world applications or experiences we've had with the topic before going into it. So if it's an article about bilingualism, as people who grew up bilingual, right, you can already connect to certain experiences you've had in your daily lives or that you've had in college. We can also preview the text. Particularly academic texts, they can be quite long, they can be a bit convoluted and difficult to get through, and it can be very overwhelming if either we're not used to reading a lot or we're not used to reading in that particular language. So instead of jumping right into it, we can take a look at a few key elements to start getting a kind of superficial understanding of what we're getting into, right? Simple as looking at the title, right? What context can you derive from the title of a text? If a text is titled the cultural implications of being bilingual, then we already know it's going to be about bilingualism and culture, right? And if we don't know what one of those terms means, we can look it up, and that's already going to give us a little bit more information going into that text. We can also look at section headings, right? So these are kind of the little subtitles that divide sections within an article. So what key ideas are being separated? Now, does it have a subheading that is culture? Does it have one that's specifically bilingualism? Does it have any extra subheadings that then they're dividing key points into those? And then briefly within the introduction, when we read that first paragraph, what do we expect for this text to talk about, right? If the introduction is saying, growing up bilingual in Puerto Rico is a very unique experience based on the colonial context of the island, then I know one of those subheadings is probably going to be about colonialism, right? And I'm expecting the text to kind of focus particularly on bilingualism within the context of a colony and not as a general skill. And what does it suggest about the rest of the text, right? So you can kind of start gathering information from these three that can help us then better introduce ourselves to a text. Prior knowledge is also helpful, right? Again, if it's particularly a text in class, what have you been studying up to this point that could connect or that you can bring into that reading? So things like presentations, lectures, in-class activities, and assignments. How do all of these work together for it to make sense for you to be reading something? If there should be a clear understanding as to why. If not, it would be pretty confusing if I just said, hey, you're gonna read this text about architecture. And it has nothing to do with the class, right? That's not very helpful. You can also scan the rest of the course content yet to be covered, right? If, let's say, we're starting a new unit, which we are today, and I were to assign you a reading before we had started it, you can look at what are the topics that are going to be covered in this section for it to make sense as to, hey, well, we're reading this now because we're going to get to a point where we talk about bilingual analysis. Okay, and then real life experiences, right? If you're familiar with the topic and have either taken a class on it before or have hands-on experience, that can be invaluable to your understanding of the text. Yeah, if you grew up bilingual, it's a lot easier to relate to a text about bilingualism than if you've only spoken one singular language your whole life. Making predictions is also helpful, so similar to purpose, looking at elements such as titles, headings, and even images can provide some context clues. So if we're reading a study, we can look at the graphs and charts before we're actually going into the written analysis of the study, and hey, we can already start getting some key information that can help us understand in what direction text is taking us. Are there any familiar key terms from the course in those elements, right? If we see bilingualism, if we see culture, if we see reading, if we see collocations, vocabulary, these are all words that we've been working through and that we can connect, or at least we can refer back to the presentations and say, oh yeah, this is what collocations were. And then previous experience with similar text or text from the same author can also provide insight, right? This is what happens where if you've read The Hunger Games and Suzanne Collins publishes a different book that has nothing to do with The Hunger Games, you might be inclined to buy the book just because of the author, right? You might not even look at what the blurb, what is this book about? You're already inclined to that similar or that previous experience. In terms of strategies while reading, it's important to visualize, right? Not everybody is an auditory learner. Sometimes we need to see things in an organized way. So creating mental images or finding images or videos online can help contextualize ideas. Sometimes we're reading something and the information is just going over our heads, but then we find a helpful YouTube video or a TikTok, and that helps us contextualize that information a little bit more clear. Asking questions, right? As you're reading, you can ask questions about things you don't understand and you have to go look up, or it can be more focused on discussion questions, right? What is the importance of a particular example being presented within the context of a reading? And then summarize, right? Rewrite and condense the main ideas in your own words. So, ay, cuidado. Sorry. No, está bien, pero cógelo con calma por ahí, que no te vayas a acordar. All right, so then summarizing, rewriting, and condensing main ideas in your own words. So we can obviously do this at the end and just have a complete overview of what the text was about. But being able to have quick annotations where you can just say, okay, here's paragraph 1, here's the main idea, that can help us then put things together. Or if we're using it for research for a paper that we're eventually going to write or an assignment we have to complete, we have then a brief summary that reminds us what each paragraph is about. That way we don't have to read the entire text again. Taking notes, right? Things like highlighting, making comments, or drafting outlines can also be a way to keep track of important ideas, right? If you're reading a particular article for an essay that you're going to write about a topic, let's say we're talking about the importance of food in culture, right? And I'm reading an essay, an academic paper that talks about it, having those highlighted sections or having a separate document where I've already copy pasted all the quotes It's a lot easier because then I don't have to go track it down and be like, oh my God, I read 3 or 4 different papers on the same topic. I don't remember where this idea came from. Have those notes to go back to. Graphic organizers also connect to the notions of visualizing, right? Things like flowcharts, story maps, mind maps, etc. Can be a great way to visualize connections, right? If I go then, okay, paragraph 1 is talking about food in general, but that is then connecting to history, right? How did this ingredient come to this country? Is it native or not? Because then maybe that historical connection connects to ideas of colonialism or slavery, right? So we can draw these connections little by little, so that we can have a clear understanding of why this text is presenting ideas the way that they are. And then reading carefully and ensuring you're fully understanding before you continue. Sometimes we read a paragraph and we finish it and we're like, I don't know what any of that meant, right? It's confusing, it's vague. So then let's go back to that paragraph. What is challenging to understand? Is there an issue with vocabulary? Maybe there's a ton of words we've never seen before. We can quickly highlight those, look them up, make an annotation on what they are, use a synonym. And that can help us reread with those synonyms, with that more accessible language, so it's easier to understand. Maybe the issue isn't that. Maybe the issue is that it uses a bunch of very long, complex sentences. So how can we rewrite those sentences in a more simple way, right? Where can we put a period where maybe there's a semicolon and separate those ideas more distinctly so it doesn't feel like, oh my God, this paragraph just feels like one very long sentence. And then strategies after reading. Summarizing and synthesizing, right? Once we've read a text, we should be able to assess what the key ideas are. I read it, okay, this text talked about the influence of food in cultural identity, and its connection to history and slavery, right? So I have that context there. How do they connect to each other? The text then talked about how, every culture has its ties to its food because it represents something about their cultural identity. However, this particular country uses one ingredient that was actually brought over during the time of slavery from a different country into this one. So it's a connection there to a historical food. And then how do those things connect to class, right? How can we then connect food and culture into the context of bilingual communication, right? So culture then is very, very tied to the way that we speak, the words that we use, and that can create issues, right? So for example, when I was doing my master's in translation, I was translating and focusing on the translations of a couple of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's works. And one issue I ran into was plátano being translated as banana and being like, they're not the same thing, right? We hear the word plátano, el plátano es un plátano, el guineo es una fruta completamente distinta, right? So not having that clarity, not having that distinction created a separation or an issue in that translation. Reviewing and reflecting. What have you learned after you read this text? Maybe you've discovered information you weren't familiar with. Or maybe it helped you connect to something you hadn't really understood in class. How does it connect to other readings or lectures, right? What ideas from class can you see reflected directly or indirectly in a text? And then experiences or applications. Now you know this information. What are you meant to do with it, right? Is it just to be able to complete an assignment, or can you actually take something that you've learned from this article and then apply it outside of the classroom? And then discussing, right? It's helpful to then sit down and say, I asked you all to do a reading and you'll have an activity you'll do. If not today, we'll do it online and then discuss in class. But discussing those key ideas. Sometimes you sit down with people who've read the exact same text and you have different key ideas or things that you found important. Doesn't necessarily mean that one person is right and one person is wrong, but being able to then see what we think is important can really tell us a lot about who we are, the things that are important to us. Sharing a summary with others, right? Being able to then explain to somebody else, hey, I'm going to tell you exactly what this text is about. And that person being able to actually understand, right? Being able to teach that information to somebody who hasn't read the article or who isn't taking the course can be a really helpful way to actually assess whether you understood the content or not. So, things that we want to look for in our pre-readings, during, and after. the first of these is the main idea, right? What is the message or point the author wants to convey? There's always going to be a particular message. So do they want you to learn something, think about or reflect on something, or do something? If you're reading a paper or a news article that's talking about the importance of promoting and improving public transportation, they might just want you to do something, right? Maybe they want you to write to your local political leader and say, hey, this is why we need this. Or maybe they want you to start integrating public transportation into your daily commutes to reduce carbon emissions, right? Or maybe they want you to learn something, right? Maybe they just want you to learn more about the services that are offered. Maybe you're not familiar with them and you actually look into it and you're like, oh, that's really interesting. There's actually more options than I thought existed. Or reflecting, right? So for example, it might end up actually going through a subtext of classism and accessibility, right? Not everybody has the money to take an Uber. Not everybody lives in an area where Uber gets there, right? So they need to rely on that public transportation, and not having it creates kind of societal barriers, right? So all those articles can technically be about the same thing, but the information is presented differently. And then where is the main idea? You can usually find it, first of all, in the title. A title should always reflect what something is about. So if I title an essay, the importance of public transportation in accessibility, and you know, at least it's gonna be something about public transportation. Something, maybe sub-theme stuff. The thesis statement, right? So that's usually the last sentence of an introduction, right? This essay will discuss how public transportation helps improve access in lower income communities, reach further job opportunities, and improve the economy, right? So those three things, I'm expecting to see them as subheadings and within the content of the essay. Headings as well, right? Topic sentences, so the first sentence of every paragraph should let me know what this paragraph is about. If I start a paragraph saying accessibility is important in all communities for the promotion of equity, that is what I'm expecting that paragraph to be about. I can't start talking about the influence of diversity in media. Or the conclusion, right? The final paragraph. It should summarize what was the point of this article, what were the key ideas or takeaways, which is also usually where you end up finding what you should do with that text. What is text mainly about, right? For example, Hurricane Maria had long-lasting effects on Puerto Rico's infrastructure and society. So if I'm reading this, the context is Puerto Rico during and after Hurricane Maria. And I'm specifically looking at subtopics or subheadings of infrastructure and society, right? So things like the electrical grid, things like people who still don't have roofs on their houses, certain access to certain roads, and then society, right? Long-term effects of things like mental health, maybe physical consequences, maybe our response to major weather events, right? So all these are things that from just this title, I can already infer. Same here, la inmigración ha cambiado la estructura social y económica de la isla. Okay, so what am I expecting to read? Estamos hablando de inmigración particularmente en Puerto Rico, right? And this could go one of two ways, right? If we're talking about la estructura social y económica, we could be looking at it from the perspective of particularly people from la República Dominicana llegando a Puerto Rico, buscando trabajo para mejorar su vida, o podemos estar hablando de la ley 22 y los estadounidenses que entonces vienen a Puerto Rico y entonces todos los problemas que eso ha generado de investigación, de la escasez de viviendas, escasez de recursos, disparidades económicas, ¿verdad? Donde tenemos personas que están viviendo de Estados Unidos están viviendo en Ocean Park, y en Condado, y en Dorado, y en Rincón, y entonces, ¿verdad? Entonces eso sigue empujando a personas que llevan todas sus vidas quizás en una comunidad fuera de su país. So, así, simplemente leyendo los títulos o diferentes oraciones, podemos entonces ir descubriendo de qué se trata un texto. Aside from the main idea, también estamos mirando lo que vienen siendo los detalles que apoyan esos puntos clave. So supporting details. Facts, examples, or explanations. So facts vienen siendo cosas como estadísticas, imágenes, videos, hechos históricos, ¿verdad? Una referencia a otro artículo. So, si yo estoy leyendo algo y me está hablando de los efectos del huracán María en cuestión de las casas que se quedan sin techo y todavía están así, imágenes de casas todavía con los toldos, that counts as a fact. That's also an example. O si estamos hablando de entonces los efectos emocionales, right? Long-term mental health effects. Maybe una estadística que diga, no me lo estoy inventando, pero 45% de los puertorriqueños sienten ansiedad cada vez que se anuncia un huracán luego del huracán María. Right? And that could be, yeah. You can usually find supporting details by focusing on that main idea, right? If I'm talking about the mental health effects, what evidence am I actually providing that this is real and I'm not me? So, for example, if you have the main idea, Hurricane Maria had long-lasting effects, supporting detail, power outages lasted for months, right? And then we're still seeing those issues en que puede ser el día más soleado del mundo y de repente no hay luz, o cayeron dos gotas de agua y también se fueron. So that can obviously support that long-lasting effect where it's been a good few years since the hurricane happened, but we're still having these problems. And then access to healthcare was disrupted, right? The hospitals didn't have power, people couldn't get treated. Not only is it disrupted, but then it's a long-term effect, right? Or a long-lasting effect because people who needed care couldn't get it, and then now that's become a chronic problem, or it's being attended to much later than it should have been. And then lastly, what is the author's purpose, right? Why did they write this text the way that they did? Author's purpose can be seen in things like tone, style, and language. If I'm just trying to share a bit of information with you, I might use a friendly tone and an informal style and casual language, right? I'm just telling you, en el weekend fui a comprar unas cosas en marchas con mi mamá, right? All I'm doing there is informing you of something that I did. However, if I'm trying to get you to learn about a topic, right, I might have a more formal tone using academic language and a more professional style, right? So then I am trying to either inform you or persuade. So in general, author's purposes follow one of these four ideals. So to inform, so providing facts or explanations, so things like articles, essays, nonfiction books, video essays, etc. Reading this or watching this video or reading this essay because it's trying to teach me about the long-lasting effects of Hurricane Maria. Persuasion, right? Convincing or arguing a point. So it might be a debate, it might be an opinion article. Right? I'm trying to get you to invest in solar panels for your home. To entertain, right? As we obviously often see in fiction, whether it be books or films or TV shows, right? You're still telling a story, usually trying to create an emotional connection, right? And then next class, we're going to talk a bit more about how reading can actually overlap with culture and empathy through this storytelling where maybe these people aren't real, right? But we can relate to them. We can feel empathy towards their situation. And that might have effects then in how we live our day-to-day lives. And then reflecting, right? Sharing personal or cultural experiences such as memoirs, right? I'm simply just going through the way that I grew up and I have these particular experiences and here's how they shaped me into the person that I am today.
When I see you around, I don't wanna talk about the weather, and I heard you're doing better.
Alright, so as a reminder, now that you've finished this presentation, if you haven't been completing the quiz while you've been watching the video, do make sure that you complete that. You have until Monday to get it done, but do make sure that it's in by Monday. And then you also have the bonus opportunity, which is what I'm going to talk about right now. Okay, so van a encontrar la actividad de bono, se titula Bonus Opportunity Reading Strategies. Está en la sección de módulos, debajo de donde mismo está el quiz. Para esa actividad, obviamente van a haber visto esta presentación Entonces, si quieren repasar la presentación, aparte de tener este video aquí en Panopto, si van a la sección de módulos y van a donde dice Reading Strategies, tienen que entrar a la sección de módulos. Estamos ya en la unidad 2, donde dice Module 2 Content Presentations. Van a seleccionar el segundo tab que dice Reading Strategies. Ahí van a encontrar la presentación. Van a ver dentro de esta oportunidad de bono que están divididos entre grupos. Dicho eso, obviamente esto es una tarea individual, especialmente pues porque es opcional. Nada más están divididos en grupos porque así entonces saben cuál lectura se les asignó. Hay 5 lecturas en total. Su nombre entonces está debajo de una de ellas. Usted va a leer la lectura que se le asignó. Entonces, basado en las destrezas que estábamos discutiendo hoy, van a identificar las ideas centrales de su texto, qué evidencia se utiliza para apoyar esas ideas centrales y cuál es el propósito del autor. Lo que tienen que entregar entonces, que puede ser en un documento de Word, debe ser respuestas a las siguientes preguntas. En la sección de pre-reading deben contestar por qué están leyendo el texto. Debe ir un poquito más allá de porque la profesora lo puso aquí en la tarea. Luego van a discutir cuál es la conexión que el contenido del texto que se les asignó tiene con el material de la clase. Luego van a explicar cómo usted puede conectar ese material a su vida personal y culminar la parte de pre-reading respondiendo con qué información les sugiere el título, los encabezados y la introducción. Luego van a la sección de during. Ahí van entonces a estar respondiendo que son unas preguntas que a usted le surgen durante su lectura del texto. Estos pueden ser preguntas de conceptos que no entiendan o pueden ser preguntas de discusión. También van a responder qué ideas ustedes pueden ver en cada párrafo. Luego, qué quizás les cuesta entender. Nuevamente, cuál es la idea central de cada párrafo y cuál es la evidencia que la apoya. Para la sección de after, van a hacer un breve resumen en sus propias palabras de qué era el mensaje del artículo. Van a explicar cuál era la meta del autor, si era informar, persuadir, entretener o reflexionar. Van a responder qué usted aprendió de ese artículo, cómo se relaciona al curso y por último, cómo usted puede usar esta información en su diario vivir. Y cierran todito con una breve reflexión donde explican cómo utilizar estas estrategias de lectura, los ayudaron a entender mejor ese artículo. Esta oportunidad de bono y el quiz son para el lunes, porque como tienen la tarea del foro para el viernes, no pensé que era justo, ¿verdad?, darles básicamente 3 tareas para el viernes y así entonces más seguro que se enfoquen en completar ese foro para el viernes y entonces tienen hasta el lunes para el quiz que sí es requerido y esta oportunidad de bono que es opcional. Si tienen cualquier dudita, in the meantime, en confianza me escriben y me dejan saber que les puedo ayudar. Y que tengan un buen día. Nos veremos entonces en clase el miércoles.